The first thing Counselor Vethorin noticed was the silence. Not the silence of empty space. She had lived with that silence for 300 years of service aboard deliberation vessels. This was different. This was the silence of a receiving bay that should have been filled with the sounds of a returning fleet, docking clamps engaging, atmosphere equalizers cycling, the low harmonic thrum of 47 warships bleeding off residual drive heat. 47 warships that had left Council space 11 days ago with full weapons complement, 3 admirals, and enough ordnance to reduce a small moon to its constituent minerals. The bay was empty. The docking coordinator, a young Thessian male whose carapace had not yet fully hardened, stood at his terminal with his secondary hands pressed flat against the console. He had not moved in 4 minutes. "Where," Vethorin said slowly, "is Task Force Meridian?" He turned. The look on his face was not the look of someone who had received bad news. It was the look of someone who had received something they had no category for. "Counselor," he said, "we don't know." The council chamber on Deliberation Station Keth Solara was designed to intimidate through architecture alone. The ceiling vaulted 40 meters overhead. The seated positions of the 7 senior counselors were elevated by precisely calibrated increments so that every visitor to the central floor looked upward when addressing them. The acoustics were engineered so that whispers in the center of the room arrived at the counselors' ears with the volume of normal speech, while voices raised in argument dissipated into the upper arches and returned as something close to humility. Vethorin had sat in the second highest chair for 19 years. She had never, in those 19 years, seen a fleet simply cease to exist. The holographic display above the central floor showed the last confirmed position of Task Force Meridian, a region of space the Galactic Cartography databases designated GS-7 Tertius, uninhabited, low resource value, strategically irrelevant. Except for one thing. GS-7 Tertius was where the humans had been building something. "The report," said Senior Counselor Drathkellen, the oldest member of the body, his scales so pale they were nearly translucent, describes the human installation as a weapons platform. He allowed a pause precisely long enough to be dismissive. A railgun installation, specifically. The word moved around the chamber the way an unexpected smell moves through a room. A few of the junior attachés exchanged looks. One of the counselors, Vainsol, who represented the Mithric Combine and had made a minor career of condescending to younger civilizations, produced a sound that was technically within the lower registers of professional decorum, but communicated quite precisely what she thought about the concept. "Railguns," she said. "They used kinetic acceleration, mass drivers, projectile physics." She let the statement exist on its own for a moment. "My people abandoned that weapons category 9,000 years ago." "They have been spacefaring for less than 300, Drathkellen agreed. It was the assessment of the Admiralty that the installation posed no meaningful threat to a fully armed engagement fleet. He looked at the empty coordinates on the holographic display. The Admiralty made that assessment 8 days ago. "Silence." "Someone," said Vethorin quietly, "needs to explain the gap between that assessment and this display." What nobody in the chamber said, what Vethorin noticed nobody was willing to say, was the question that was actually sitting in the center of the room, taking up more space than any of them wanted to acknowledge. 47 warships. 47. Gone. And the humans had done it with something the Mithric Combine had discarded as primitive 9 millennia, before humanity had invented written language. The Council assigned 3 investigative functions simultaneously. This was standard procedure when the stakes exceeded a certain threshold. 3 independent analysis teams operating in parallel, their findings to be compiled and cross-referenced before any conclusions were presented. It was a system designed to prevent groupthink, to eliminate confirmation bias, to ensure that the truth would surface regardless of which team found it first. What the system was not designed for was the possibility that all three teams would independently return with findings that contradicted each other in ways that made each finding individually more disturbing, not less. The first team, led by Admiral Prethnon, focused on physical evidence. They sent sensor drones into GS-7 Tertius. What the drones found was not wreckage, or rather, it was not wreckage in any configuration that matched the destruction profiles of known weapon systems. The debris field was wrong. The energy signatures were wrong. The dispersion pattern of the material was consistent with a very specific physical phenomenon, one that Admiral Prethnon's team initially misidentified as the residual signature of a catastrophic drive failure. It wasn't, but they didn't know that yet, and so their preliminary report concluded, with a confidence rating of 73%, that Task Force Meridian had experienced some form of catastrophic internal malfunction. The second team reviewed intelligence intercepts. The humans, and this would become important later, though nobody recognized its importance at the time, had been unusually communicative in the weeks before Task Force Meridian's deployment. Their radio transmissions, their data packet communications, their bureaucratic logistics traffic, all of it had increased. The intelligence team interpreted this as evidence of a civilization in distress, a civilization scrambling, a civilization that had detected the approaching fleet and was desperately attempting to coordinate a response to an overwhelming threat. "They knew we were coming," said senior intelligence analyst Sane Taru, presenting these findings to the council. "The volume of communication suggests a government in crisis management mode." "That aligns with what we expected," Councillor Vainsall said. "The installation was provocative. They knew the consequence." "Yes," Sane Taru said. And then, after a pause that Vethorin would later remember as the first genuine indicator that something was wrong. "Although there is one anomaly in the traffic pattern I can't fully account for." "Anomaly," Drathkellen said. "The volume of communication increases, yes. That's consistent with crisis management. But the tone of the communications is inconsistent with distress." He hesitated. "Our translation matrices are still incomplete for the human primary language groupings, so I cannot give you certainty here. But the pattern analysis suggests the communications were not fearful in nature." Another pause. They were anticipatory. Nobody asked the obvious follow-up question. In retrospect, everyone would wish someone had. The third team was the smallest. 2 members. A xenopsychologist named Oruveth, no relation to Councillor Vethorin, despite what the similarity of names implied, and a military historian called San Pilo, who had spent 40 years studying the conflict patterns of developing civilizations. Their report was the last to arrive. It was also the shortest. When Vethorin read it, she read it twice. Then she set it down on her desk and looked at the wall for a long time. The report contained one central finding, supported by 14 pages of detailed analysis that she largely skimmed, because the central finding was the part that mattered. The finding was this: the humans had not built one installation. The installation in GS-7, Tertius, was the installation they had built in a location they expected to be found. It was the installation they had placed in the most visible, most survey-accessible, most easily detectable position within their territorial boundary. It was large. It was obvious. It had been transmitting low-level signals consistent with active operation for almost a year. San Pilo's historical analysis noted a pattern he had observed in 14 previous developing civilizations. When a species at the early spacefaring stage becomes aware of a larger military threat, they frequently attempt to deceive by concealment, sometimes with minimal success. Then he noted that the humans had not done this. They had done something he had no historical precedent for. They had built something obvious and placed it in the most visible location possible, and transmitted its existence across multiple frequencies, and done all of this. His analysis concluded, not because they were unaware of the threat, and not because they lacked the sophistication for concealment, but because they wanted the fleet to come there. The installation in GS7, Tertius, was bait. Vethorin set the report down. She picked up her communications terminal. "I need to speak to Admiral Prethnon," she said, "and I need him to tell me very precisely how many debris fields his sensor drones have located." The answer when it came was one. One debris field. 47 ships. Which meant that whatever the humans had built that wasn't the GS7 installation, they hadn't used it yet. How do they survive? Admiral Prethnon asked the question 40 minutes into what had become an emergency full council session, and he asked it with a flatness in his voice that Vethorin recognized as the particular vocal quality of a military officer confronting something their training had not prepared them for. Physiologically, how do human beings survive in that tactical environment? Oruveth, the xenopsychologist, had been brought into the session at Vethorin's request. She stood on the central floor looking up, as everyone did, and answered carefully. They have a significant pain tolerance relative to their mass and nervous system complexity, she said. Their biology is unusual in several respects, but I don't think physiology is the relevant variable here, Admiral. Then what is? Decision architecture, she said. When most sapient species encounter a situation in which the projected cost of an action exceeds the projected benefit, when the math, simply put, indicates that the action will result in a net loss, the standard response is to seek an alternative action. This is rational. This is what intelligence is for. She paused. Humans do not reliably do this. The chamber was very quiet. That is not to say they're irrational, she continued quickly. They are capable of extraordinary strategic sophistication, as the GS7 operation demonstrates, but there is a category of situation that humans enter where rational cost-benefit processing appears to become secondary to something else entirely, to something they call, she consulted her notes, by various terms across their languages: stubbornness, principle, honor. The point at which they decide something matters more than their own survival. What triggers that state? Prethnon asked. We're not entirely sure, Oruveth admitted. But the working hypothesis, based on historical behavioral analysis, is threat to something they've decided they love. The word sat strangely in the translation matrix. The galactic standard equivalent was a concept several of the council species had, but it carried different weights in different biologies. In some, it was a neurochemical attachment state with a limited duration. In the Thesian physiological framework, it was a bonding protocol that served reproductive function and then gradually attenuated. In humans, Oruveth had come to believe, it did not attenuate. Love, Counselor Vainsall said, and there it was again, that technical lower register sound that communicated what she thought. They made a weapons decision based on an emotional bonding state. They made a weapons decision, Vethorin said quietly, from her elevated chair, that destroyed 47 of our ships. I would ask the Council to perhaps table the commentary on human emotional architecture until we've finished processing that fact. Silence. There is another element, Oruveth said. She seemed uncertain whether to continue. The drones that surveyed the GS7 debris field, Admiral Prethnon, in your preliminary assessment, you identified the destruction signature as consistent with catastrophic drive failure. My team revised that assessment, Prethnon said. Yes to what? A pause. We identified it, he said slowly, as consistent with kinetic impact from a very large mass moving at a very high velocity, multiple impacts, simultaneous or near simultaneous, across the entire fleet formation. He stopped. Then, at velocities inconsistent with anything in our weapons database. Velocities inconsistent, Oruveth repeated. What does that mean precisely? It means, Prethnon said, that the projectiles that destroyed Task Force Meridian were moving fast enough that the energy release upon impact is not categorized in our system as a weapon's effect. He seemed to have difficulty with the next part. It's categorized as a geological event. The scale of energy release is more consistent with what we'd associate with a natural catastrophic phenomenon than with a deliberate weapons discharge. Vane Saul made a different sound this time. Not dismissal. Something closer to the sound a person makes when the ground shifts beneath them. They built railguns, she said, not contemptuously this time, as if she were trying to make the words fit around something that didn't have the right shape. They built railguns that fire fast enough to produce geological-scale impact events. In an environment, Oruveth said quietly, where we believed they couldn't possibly have the industrial capacity to build anything of military significance. Where did they get the power? Prethnon demanded. That level of kinetic output requires. We're still calculating, Oruveth said, but the preliminary estimate is that they have been redirecting their entire system's asteroid extraction economy for approximately 8 years, not to build more ships, not to develop drive technology, to build the installation, and to build the power generation infrastructure for the installation, and to build, she looked down at her notes, what their communications traffic appears to call the second and third positions. The room processed that. Second and third, Vethorn said. They appear to have built 3 of them, Oruveth said. We've only found one, and as your team has noted, they haven't used the others yet. Here was what the Council did not know, and what the story they were constructing for themselves would not allow them to see. The man standing inside the second installation, the one that did not yet appear on any Council sensor sweep, buried inside an asteroid cluster the humans called the Marin Belt, was not a general. He was not an admiral. He was not a politician or a strategist or an architect of civilization-level decisions. His name was Sergeant Elias Wren, and he was 34 years old, and he had a photograph in his chest pocket, worn soft at the edges from being touched too many times, of 2 children and a woman standing in front of what appeared to be a body of water, and he had not seen any of them in 16 months. The installation around him was 3 years of work by 11,000 people, most of whom were now dead or relocated. It was 12 kilometers of superconducting rail embedded inside the living rock of an asteroid that was itself 17 kilometers across. It was power cells that had taken 4 years to manufacture and would take another 6 months to fully recharge after a single firing sequence. It was targeting systems that required the cooperation of 17 satellite relay stations, 6 of which had already been destroyed by Council probes, which meant the targeting solution for the second position was currently running at a reliability of 61%. 61%. Elias Wren knew this number. He had been told this number by Commander Yashida Pharaoh, his the woman who had designed the targeting relay architecture, in a conversation 3 hours ago, during which she had also told him that she believed Command was going to authorize a second firing sequence within 48 hours, because the intelligence intercepts suggested the Council was already preparing a second fleet. Larger than the first. 61%, he'd said. Yes, she'd said. That means 4 times in 10 we miss. That means 4 times in 10 we miss the intended target, she said carefully. He'd looked at her. The installation fires a fixed-axis sequence, she said, if we miss the intended target formation. The rounds keep going, he said. The rounds keep going, she confirmed. What neither of them said next was the completion of that sentence. They both knew it. Elias had a photograph in his pocket and Yashida Pharaoh had a different photograph in a different pocket, and the completion of the sentence was the reason both of those photographs existed. Because they had both, at some point, looked at the people in those photographs and decided that some things mattered more than sensible math. "What does command say about the targeting reliability threshold?" he asked. "Command says 61% is acceptable given the strategic necessity," she said. "What do you say?" A long pause. "I say I've been working on the relay restoration for 72 hours, and I think I can get us to 78%, she said. "I need 36 more hours. The authorization window is 48. "But I know." "Then you have 36 hours, he said. She had left to go work on the relays. He had stayed because the installation required a minimum crew of 1 for operational readiness protocols, and also because he had found, in the years since this had all started, that he was better at staying somewhere that needed staying than he was at any of the alternatives. Back on Keth Solara, the third team's report had now been distributed to all council members, and the reaction it had generated had moved through 3 distinct phases in approximately 2 hours. The first phase was denial, which had a very short half-life in the face of a debris field. The second phase was a kind of offended incredulity, not at the humans, but at the Council's own intelligence apparatus. "How?" Councillor Drathkellen asked, in a tone that suggested he intended to find someone specific to hold responsible. "Did we not know about the power generation infrastructure? 8 years of construction, redirecting an entire extraction economy. How is there no record in our survey data?" The answer, when Sain Taru provided it, was the moment the second phase ended and the third phase began. "There is a record," the intelligence analyst said. "It's in our survey archives from 4 years ago. The asteroid cluster, now designated as the secondary suspected position, showed anomalous thermal output in a Class 3 resource survey. The survey classification system flagged it as a probable geothermal event and automatically assigned it a low-priority follow-up review date of, he checked, approximately 6 years from the time of survey." 6 years, Vethorin said. The human construction project was inside the window between the anomaly detection and the scheduled follow-up. We would have investigated, eventually, after they had finished building whatever they were building. Drathkellen was very still. "You're telling me we scheduled a follow-up review of an anomaly that was, in fact, a weapons program, and set that review date to occur after the weapons program would have been completed. The system had no reason to believe a Class 3 world system occupied by a pre-FTL-era civilization, 300 years into spaceflight, could be developing anything of military concern," Sain Taru said. "Our classification algorithms were built on 10,000 years of encounter data. In 10,000 years, no civilization at the human development stage has ever." "Has ever what?" Drathkellen said. Sain Taru hesitated. "Has ever apparently decided that their inadequacy was a weapon," he said. The third phase of the Council's reaction to the third team's report was silence. The specific silence of people who have realized that the map they were using to navigate was drawn for a different territory entirely. "There's something else," Sain Taru said. He seemed reluctant. "The communication pattern analysis I mentioned earlier, the anticipatory quality. We've now had 26 more hours of human communication traffic to analyze. Our translation matrices are still incomplete, but we've achieved sufficient coverage to get semantic content on approximately 40% of the volume. And the communications are not about the installation," he said. "They're not about the fleet. They're not about the debris field or the political consequences or the loss of life on our side or the threat of retaliation." He paused. "The dominant communication theme in 40% of their traffic across multiple transmission sources in the past 26 hours is a discussion of whether they gave us enough time to turn around." Every counselor in the room went very still. "They wanted the fleet to turn around," Vethorin said slowly. "The semantic analysis suggests yes. There's a specific concept recurring across multiple human language communications. We've rendered it as the warning. As in, they appear to believe that sending an obviously visible installation to an obviously detectable location and transmitting its existence broadly was intended to constitute a warning, a demonstration of capability in lieu of a demonstration of intent. Vainsal made a sound. They thought we would see it, she said. See the installation, understand it was a trap and leave. Yes. We sent a fleet to destroy it. Yes. A pause. And now their primary communication is about whether they gave us enough time to change course before. Vainsal stopped. Before Task Force Meridian crossed the firing threshold, Saintaru confirmed. The architecture of the last 3 days restructured itself in Vethorin's mind. The crisis-level communication volume in the days before the fleet arrived, not panic, not scrambling, debate. They were debating whether to fire, whether the Council had understood what the installation was supposed to mean, whether the ships moving toward it represented a deliberate choice to press the engagement or a failure to read the signal. They had been waiting, right up to the threshold, to see if the fleet would stop. They didn't want to destroy the fleet, Vethorin said. No. They destroyed it because we didn't understand that we weren't supposed to. As best we can determine, Saintaru said, yes. And then, Vethorin said, after destroying 47 warships, their primary concern was whether they had given us enough warning. Yes. The silence this time was different from every previous silence in the chamber. It had a texture to it. We are, Drathkellen said very quietly, preparing a second fleet. Yes, Vethorin said. Larger than the first. Yes. With orders to locate and destroy all human military installations, beginning with any suspected secondary positions. Those were the orders issued 20 hours ago, she confirmed. Before we knew, he said. Before we knew, she agreed. Nobody said what they were all thinking. It sat in the room with them, the way the word love had sat in the room earlier, occupying more space than its syllables should have allowed. The second fleet was already moving. And the humans, if Saintaru's analysis was correct, were right now watching it approach, running the same calculation they had run before Task Force Meridian crossed the threshold, asking themselves the same question. Did we give them enough time? Elias Wren had been awake for 31 hours when Commander Yashida Pharaoh's voice came over the installation comm. 79%, she said. He sat up from where he'd been resting against the main console. You're done. 79.3, she said. I'll take it. How many relays? 14 operational. I lost 2 more in the last 12 hours. Council probe activity is increasing in the outer belt, but the geometry works with 14. A pause. Fleet. He checked the sensor display. Still on approach vector, no course correction. How long to threshold? 11 hours. A longer pause this time. Command's authorization window opens in 9, she said. I know. Elias, she didn't use his name often. The second fleet is 6 times the size of the first one. I know. A second firing sequence. The power cells won't recharge in time, not for a third. I know. If Command authorizes and we fire and we don't achieve sufficient attrition, if 6 times the fleet gets through to the third position, the third installation isn't finished yet. They'll destroy it before it's operational. I know, he said. So this is it, one shot. One shot, he agreed. Silence on the comm. Then, what are they thinking, the Council? What are they thinking right now, do you suppose? He looked at the photograph in his chest pocket. He didn't take it out. He just pressed his hand flat against it, the way you press your hand against a wall to feel if there's heat behind it. I think, he said, that they're probably thinking we're angry, That we're doing this because we're angry, or because we want their territory, or because we've decided we're at war. He paused. I don't think they understand that we just want them to go away. That's not a very civilized thing to want, Yashida said. Something in her voice made it sound like she was smiling or trying to. No, he agreed. But we're only 300 years out of our own atmosphere. We haven't had time to get civilized yet. The Second Fleet crossed the threshold 9 hours and 47 minutes later, which was 38 minutes after Command's authorization window opened, which was 17 minutes after Yashida had confirmed targeting solution locked and firing readiness achieved. The Council did not receive Vethorin's emergency communication in time. The emergency communication contained the full analysis of the human message traffic, the complete translation, which the Matrix had finally achieved sufficient coverage to produce. The diplomatic framing the humans had apparently embedded in their public transmissions for the past 8 years, in every major language grouping, addressed specifically to any galactic civilization that might encounter their system. The translation was, in its entirety, "We know what we are. We know what you are. We know what the distance between those two things looks like from where you stand. We are not asking you to be afraid of us. We are asking you to consider the possibility that a species which built this with what we had in the time we had because we had no other choice is a species that you would rather have building things beside you than against you. Go home. We will not pursue. That is our offer, and it will not be made twice." Vethorin read it 3 times at her console, while the Second Fleet crossed the threshold. Then she read it a 4th time. Because there was a line at the end she kept stopping at. A line the translation matrix had flagged as culturally uncertain. The idiomatic content didn't map cleanly onto galactic standard. The matrix had offered 2 possible renderings and noted that it could not determine with confidence which was more accurate. The first rendering, "We hope you choose to leave." The second rendering, "We are still hopping you will choose to leave." Present tense, active. "Get me a direct channel to Admiral Fleet Commander Cthran," she said. "Emergency priority. Override authorization Vethorin 773. The comm officer looked up. "Counselor, the fleet is within the deployment envelope. Any course correction at this point." "Get me the channel," she said. He got her the channel. "Fleet Commander," she said when Cthran's face appeared on her screen, "I need you to execute an emergency course reversal. All ships, immediately." Cthran stared at her. He was a heavily scarred officer of the old school, the kind who had built a career on certainty. "Counselor, we are 42 minutes from engagement range. My orders are." "Your orders are superseded," she said. "I am invoking emergency council authority. Turn the fleet around." "On what grounds?" "On the grounds," she said, and she heard something strange in her own voice as she said it, something she didn't have a name for in her own language, "that we were warned, Fleet Commander. We were warned the first time. We are being warned right now, and I am choosing not to find out what they do when they run out of warnings." Cthran looked at her. The expression on his face moved through several things in quick succession. She watched it happen, the calculation behind his eyes, the military calculus of following orders versus following a live emergency override from a senior counselor. 20 minutes ago," she said quietly, "I received a full translation of human communications over the last 8 years. They told us what they were building. They told us why. They told us what they were offering." She held up the text on her screen so he could see it, though she knew the resolution was insufficient for him to read it. "They have been trying to talk to us. We never thought to listen because we never thought they had anything to say." A pause. "I'm listening now," she said. "Turn the fleet around." The Second Fleet crossed the threshold and then, 22 minutes later, began to reverse course. The reversal took 11 minutes to fully execute. 11 minutes during which Elias Wren stood at the firing console inside the second position, his hand on the authorization interface, watching the sensor display show him 274 enemy warships at the edge of his targeting solution, watching the firing readiness indicator holding steady at green, watching the communication from command that said hold fire, council contact, hold fire, hold fire. 11 minutes. He stood there for all 11 of them. He watched the fleet stop. He watched it reverse. He watched it move, slowly and then with increasing confidence, back across the threshold and away. He didn't fire. He also didn't take his hand off the authorization interface until the last ship had cleared the threshold. That took another 40 minutes. He stood there for all of those minutes too. When it was done, he sat down on the floor of the installation, with the superconducting rail above him and the rock of the asteroid around him, and the cold of space insulated away by 3 meters of shielding, and he took the photograph out of his chest pocket. He looked at it for a long time. Yashidafero's voice came over the comm. "They're gone." "They're gone," he confirmed. "Did you?" "No," he said. Silence. Then, was it close? He thought about that. He thought about 11 minutes and 274 warships and 79.3% reliability and the weight of an authorization interface under his palm. "No," he said, because he had decided it wasn't. Because he had looked at the photograph and decided that the children in it deserved a universe where the answer was no, and he had held on to that decision for 42 minutes, and it was the truest thing he had done in 16 months. "Command is calling," Yashidafero said. "There's going to be a diplomatic contact request from the council. They want," a pause as if she was reading, "they want to understand what we were trying to tell them." He looked at the photograph one more time. Then he folded it carefully and put it back in his pocket. "Tell them we'll talk," he said. "Tell them we were always willing to talk." Counselor Vethorin never forgot the expression on Fleet Commander Cthran's face when she had held up the translation on her screen. She returned to that expression often in the years that followed, the years of slow, careful, frequently interrupted diplomatic process. The years of trying to build a framework between two civilizations that had nearly destroyed each other in the space of 11 days. The years in which the Council gradually assembled a more complete picture of what humanity had done and how, and at what cost. The picture took years to assemble because humans were not forthcoming, not from hostility, from what Oruveth eventually identified as a deep species-level instinct to understate, particularly about suffering. The full scope of what the construction of the 3 installations had required, in material, in years, in lives, in the kind of civilizational sacrifice that required a species to look at its children and say not yet. There is still something we need to do first. Took the Council's researchers 6 years of careful study to even partially understand. They never fully understood it. What Vethorin came to believe, after years of study, after meetings with human diplomats and xenopsychologists and historians, and one particular conversation with a former installation crew member who still walked with a permanent injury from the construction process, and who answered her questions with a directness that she found both disarming and slightly frightening, was this. The galactic community had spent 10,000 years developing a framework for understanding intelligent life. That framework was built on the assumption that intelligence, wherever it arose, would be subject to the same fundamental logic, that organisms do not voluntarily accept greater loss than necessary, that civilizations scale their sacrifice to their resources, that at the end of every cost-benefit analysis, survival would win. The framework was correct for every civilization they had ever encountered. And then there were humans, who had sat in their one small solar system, with 300 years of spaceflight experience and no FTL and no galactic allies and technology that most Council member species would describe as archaeological, and built 3 weapons installations that could destroy fleets in secret over 8 years, while pointing to one of them and saying, "Look, this is what we can do. Please don't make us do it." And when the fleet came anyway, when 47 warships crossed the line that the humans had been broadcasting for a year as a line not to cross, they fired. And then they stood at the edge of their second shot, with the second fleet in range and the authorization active, and they held. Because the fleet turned around. That was the part that stayed with Vethorin, not the destruction of the first fleet, which was devastating and terrible, and changed the Council's understanding of military risk in permanently uncomfortable ways. Not the capability, which the engineers and physicists would spend decades trying to fully map. The part that stayed with her was the holding. 274 warships, an active targeting solution, an operator with a hand on the authorization interface, and the decision to wait 42 minutes and see if the math would change. Why, she had asked, in that conversation with the former crew member, the one who walked with the permanent injury. When you had us, when the targeting solution was active and the second fleet was in range and you could have, why did you wait? He'd looked at her for a moment. Then he'd done something humans did that still, after years of interaction, produced in Vethorin, a sensation she had no name for in her own language. He'd smiled. Small and tired and containing something that was not quite sadness and not quite satisfaction, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. Because, he said, we were hopping you'd choose to leave. Present tense, active. She hadn't slept well that night. She didn't sleep well for a long time afterward. The Council reclassified humanity 14 months after the diplomatic framework was established. The new classification was the highest alert tier, not a threat designation, but something the classification committee had needed to invent a new category to express. The working definition of the category, which was debated extensively before being adopted, was rendered in galactic standard as approximately a civilization that is not the strongest species in the known galaxy, and knows it, and has organized its entire existence around the possibility that strength is not the relevant variable. The category, as of the last revision, contained one entry. The railguns were never fired again. The humans left them in place. They said it wasn't a threat. They said it was a reminder.